think we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone, and thank you for attending today's P&A Senate Seminar Series event. My name is Monica Koken, and I am a senator on the Academic, Professional, and Administrative P&A Senate. We're delighted to see another great turnout for this virtual event series with staff from all campuses and Extension. I want to thank everyone who submitted questions in advance. And we appreciate and value your engagement at this event. And let's see, I have done recording, so we are all good there. Our topic today is Compensation 101, compensation planning in the annual budget process. This is a very timely topic for many of us, and we hope that this webinar will illuminate how the university plans for compensation increases, how compensation fits into the overall budget, and the timeline for making budget decisions. Our presenter today is Julie Tonneson, Vice President for Budget and Finance and the university's Budget Director. Prior to joining the university in 1993 as a budget analyst, Vice President Tonneson served as the Executive Budget Officer for the State of Minnesota Department of Finance, coordinating and monitoring all aspects of Minnesota's K-12 education operating and capital budgets on behalf of the executive branch. She holds a master's degree in public affairs from the Hubert H. Humphrey School of Public Affairs. In her current role, Vice President Tonneson is responsible for advancing the excellence of the university by developing, aligning, integrating, and managing budget and finance strategies through a coordinated approach for the University of Minnesota system, serving key stakeholders in the university's leadership, the Board of Regents, academic and support leaders, and financial managers, faculty and staff, executive and legislative branches of the state of Minnesota, and the general public. Before we start, as a reminder, please use the chat or Q&A feature to share your questions or comments during Vice President Tonneson's presentation. We will hold all questions and comments until the Q&A portion of the event. To frame today's Q&A part, Julie will first address the pre-submitted questions, then any questions asked live as they specifically relate to budgeting. She will not be able to answer questions related to compensation decisions for individual people or specific groups within the university, nor can she speak to the analysis that OHR does or processes that they are responsible for, like market analysis and bargaining unit issues, among other things. While budget and finance does interface with OHR and the process of setting an overall university budget is one thing, the decisions about how to implement that budget are another, and these decisions are more at the HR and unit level. We will try to get to many of the budgeting questions as we can. So let's go ahead and begin. Please welcome Vice President Julie Tonneson.
Great. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to share my screen and the presentation as we get started here. So bear with me for a second. There we go. As Monica mentioned, this is about budgeting for compensation, but I want to start by, I guess, framing the conversation around why it's important for us to think about the operating budget more generally before we get into the specific compensation things. So I'm going to walk through the operating budget structure, the revenue and expense variables that we play with, if you will, in the budget and make decisions about who's involved in the process, where are they involved, when are they involved, who makes the decisions, the timeline for the decisions in developing the university's budget. And then we'll talk specifically about compensation as part of that budget. It is our largest expense every single year. So it's a very important part of the budget, and we will talk about that. And a little bit on where we have consultation built into the budgeting process. This today is a form of consultation. It's a form of trying to communicate with folks throughout the university on how things work and to hear questions and concerns. So with that, I'm going to get started. We have really two different operating budget processes at the university, and it gets a little confusing. But every 2 years, we are required, or maybe not required, but we choose to ask the state of Minnesota for appropriations for the next 2 years. The state runs on a biennial cycle, so they approve appropriations to the university in 2-year chunks. And so in the even numbered year, and I will show you this on a chart, In the summer of an even-numbered year, we start that process. Simultaneously, we have to do an annual budget process for the university every year, which means we set a budget, we recommend a budget to the board, they take action on it prior to July 1 of every year. Our fiscal year runs July 1 to June 30th. So, and hopefully this will be more understandable when I get to the chart, but conceptually, we have the biennial budget development as part 1 of our budgeting process. Within the upcoming biennium, which is 2 fiscal years in gray, we will complete and have the board take action on an FY24 annual budget, operating budget, and an FY25 annual operating budget. To supplement this activity, we do regularly update longer range financial planning assumptions to try to foresee what might be coming down our path in the future. And that just helps us put together the 2-year time frame planning documents. So that's conceptually how the operating budgets are structured. Now, within the annual operating budget, and actually within the 2-year time frame biennial request as well, we start by thinking about the budget at a very high level, 30,000 foot level, university totals. We do some planning around what are we going to assume for changes in resources and changes in expenditures. The changes in resources have to equal or exceed the change of our expenditures. The whole budget is based on, at this level, an incremental budgeting approach, which means that it's based on the understanding that the base budget is balanced. And so as we move forward, we need to make sure any decisions we make about major budget variables continue to balance against each other so that the whole budget remains balanced. And that's what you see here on this chart is our examples of those major resource variables on the left and the major cost variables on the right. So as we develop our budget, we think about what do we want to do for or assume for tuition rate increases? What do we want to assume for state appropriation changes, which we can talk more about? What do we want to assume for our internal reallocation planning, which is where we ask units to, everyone has been involved in this, no doubt, do budget cuts, which means you stop spending your existing dollars on one thing in order to free up those resources to spend on something else, a cost increase or a higher priority item. And that's a planned part of the budget every year, so planned reallocations. And once in a while, we have growth in other revenues, might be sales income, might be indirect cost recovery revenue, it might be endowment earnings, things like that, that actually are not committed to certain costs and that they become more discretionary. So that becomes part of our conversation as well. And at the same time, we look at what do we want to plan for compensation, which is something we'll talk about more today. What do we want to plan for programmatic investments? Every year we have facility cost increases and technology infrastructure cost increases. And then every unit brings up things. I always say this is a wonderful place to work because you hear about so many exciting things, but all those exciting things come with new cost. And so we always hear about, what do they want to add to the plate? So those pieces, those incremental increases in our discretionary resources and incremental increases in expenditures are part of that very high level planning that begins the budget process, and they have to be balanced. This is an example of, this is an FY21 budget framework where this pretty simple math, but this is that high level balancing act. What were the estimated increases in resources for FY21? You see them listed here, very little state appropriation. In 2 different lines, we had actually a decrease in tuition revenue that year. This is a COVID impacted fiscal year, so it's a little bit unusual. But you can see the rest of them there. We had internal reallocation, other revenues, and so forth. And that was used to pay for the expenditures down below. Compensation, we had core service needs, that's the facilities and technology infrastructure on the bottom, and so on and so forth. And at the bottom, you can see that it was balanced at $600,000. So This is just an example of that high level incremental budget planning math that we do every year as part of the framework. And we are in the process of creating that and working on that and refining it for FY24 right now. Now, who's involved in this process of the budget overall? These are the players. The president is the one who sets the high level goals around the variables that I just talked through. So the president is the one that ultimately decides what she wants to take to the board as the recommended tuition rate increase, as the recommended internal reallocation or budget cutting targets, as the compensation, the general compensation pool increase, how much she wants to spend on strategic investments and so forth. She decides that. And then what she does is, and it's, in consultation with her leadership team, she's not, doesn't do it in isolation. But ultimately then she delegates to what's called the budget committee, the budget process. And the budget committee is made up of 6 people right now who work on behalf of the institution. So we have put on our institutional hats to shepherd the university community through this process. And who's on that right now? Me as the budget director, my boss, the CFO, Myron Franz, the provost, Rachel Croson, the vice president for clinical academic affairs, Jacob Tolar, the vice president for research, Shashank Priya, and our vice president for equity and diversity. That's Mercedes Ramirez Fernandez. And the 6 of us working with the president, take those high level assumptions and turn them into budget instructions that we send out to units, to support units in September, to academic units in January. And then we meet with every unit every year to talk through what they submit through this process. So moving down this table, the chancellors, deans, and vice presidents receive the budget instructions, and they need to respond to us with answers. And they bring forward their top priorities, their challenges, their responses to specific questions that we might ask in terms of what would you do if you had to cut X amount of dollars? What is your tuition revenue estimate given these assumptions? All those kind of technical things, but also their priorities and their strategies and what they would like to invest in. That's part of their response as well. How they involve their departments, which is the next row down, depends on their management style. We have a very distributed management structure. So not every dean and chancellor and vice president operates the same way. Some of them will involve their departments. They might have quite an extensive and robust internal budget process within their unit. Others, by virtue of their size or just their management style, are not going to have as much of an inclusive kind of process, but it is up to them in terms of how they develop their plans that they then turn into their submissions to us. Ultimately, when they turn it into us, we meet with them, we come to understand what issues they put on the table. We then work with the president in an iterative process back and forth with her about what she wants to do for each unit and what kind of issues she wants to put on the table for each unit. Ultimately, she recommends a balanced budget. It has to come together, it has to balance. So all the decisions she makes are toward that end, and they have to be submitted as part of one complete budget to the board for review and action in the spring, early summer. So these are the units. When I talk about units of the university, these are the units that we work with on the budget and the level of the institution that we hold accountable for the financial activity that occurs within it. So what you see over on the left are all of the academic units on the Twin Cities campus, primarily colleges, but includes Minnesota Extension and the Ag Experiment Station. And then the system campuses down on the lower left, each one is its own budgeting unit. The support units are in the middle and on the right columns. Those with an asterisk are treated in the budget process just like either in whole or in part. They are treated like a college, like an academic unit. So Gopher Athletics, for example, or the centers within the vice president for research office, those units are and we can go into this if anybody wants to in questions, but they are treated like an academic unit in terms of what they have to respond to in the budget process. Now the timeline that I'm going to start with this black box. That's the framework, that high level math I showed you a couple slides back, planning what we're going to do for the next 2 years in terms of those variables, tuition, reallocation, compensation, etc. We have to do that in order to help us contextualize what we're going to ask for from the state of Minnesota. It's not in a vacuum. I'm not just going to say, well, state of Minnesota, give me $20 million and I'll figure out what to do with it. Instead, we try to create this 2-year framework, what we really need, and determine from that how the state appropriation can fit into that plan and that solution. So that's done and starts in this black box in the even numbered year in the summer. Then from that, we develop our biennial request to the state of Minnesota in these maroon boxes, so that the board takes action on it actually in October. We submit it to the state of Minnesota in October of the even numbered year, so just this last October. We're right now working with the legislative bodies to explain our request and make sure they understand it, answer all their questions. And ultimately, we don't know what our appropriation is going to be for the next 2 years until the end of May. Simultaneously, while this is going on, we are building the university's annual FY24 budget in this case. And you can see it starts in August, September. We send out our instructions in September. We meet with all of our support units in October, November. We make preliminary decisions on their budgets in December, and then we shift and do the academic unit process starting in January. They get their instructions. We're going to start meeting with them the end of this month and through March and into April. And then once we know what our state appropriation is, we have to pull it all together. We have to make the tough decisions and pull it all together so that the board will hear our recommended budget in June, early June, and approve it in late June. In the second year of the biennium, we do not have to redo the black box, but we do tweak it because now we know what our state appropriation is. But we may decide in this intervening year that we want to do something different for compensation. We want it to be higher or lower. We want to do something different for tuition rates. A lot happens in a year. And so sometimes our goals and priorities shift a little bit. So we'll tweak the black box for the second year, but then the process is exactly the same. We don't have to wait for our appropriation in May, so we can bring our budget to the board for review in May and approval in June. They don't have to have that sort of shortened time frame like they do in the first year. So that's the time frame of pulling this all together. And where we are right now in February, as I mentioned, is we are between support and academic units and about to enter into our meetings with the academic units. Now I'm going to shift a little bit here to, that's the sort of an overview of the budget itself and the budget process. But I'm going to shift to, as I mentioned, our largest spending category in the budget is salary and fringe. So compensation. And this is just a history, the last 10 years, 11 years actually, FY13 through FY23, of what we have approved as the general compensation pool increase, the salary increase for the institution as part of the budget, and then the dollar amounts that it costs for only the state appropriation and tuition funds. And I will mention that whatever decision is made on that first line in terms of the plan percentage increases, that applies to all funding sources. So it's regardless of source. We don't think about if you're paid by this fund, you get to have this amount of a pool, and if you're paid by if you're paying people by a different resource, you have a different size pool. You can see here a couple of things prior to the pandemic. In FY13 through FY20, pretty consistently 2 to 2.5%. At that time, FY13 through FY20, the inflation rates, the high inflation rate during that time period was 2.4%. That was in FY18. The lowest inflation rate during that time period was 2015, where it was 0.1%. So this was a period of very low inflation, and we were making decisions within the university's budget to support these compensation pools at 2 to 2.5%. Then the pandemic hit. That impacted 2 years of our budget planning significantly, FY21 and FY22. And so you're all familiar, if you were here at the time, that we had a salary freeze except for bargaining unit employees in FY21. I'm sorry, yeah, and then in FY22, a lower increase as we were trying to work our way out of the pandemic of 1.5%. But then this year, I will say that we ended up with an increase 3.85%, which is the highest pool increase we have planned for and budgeted for since I've been at the university, which is 30 years. So it was meaningful in that it's a very expensive proposition for us to plan for and budget for those types of increases. Overall, our spending, about 62% this year, is planned spending on compensation of our entire budget, just that one item, compensation. Everything else, are obviously much smaller percents make up the remaining 38%. Now, when we think about what we want to settle on for that percentage pool increase, there are a number of things that we take into account, and probably even more than are on this chart, but these are some of the main ones. First of all, it's sort of a market consideration, and here is where we do have conversations with HR, that they help us to understand what's happening in the higher education industry generally, amongst our peers, our particular peers, what's happening in the state and in terms of public sector compensation planning and private industry, and so forth, because we are like a mini economy, the university. We have many, many different types of employees, and we compete in many, many different arenas for talent. And so there isn't one answer, but from a budgeting perspective and a planning perspective, we have to roll it up. So at that high university level, we have to say, what is the pool increase across? And I will come back to some comments about within that pool, how we address some of those market issues. But that is the consideration. What's happening elsewhere? Secondly, we look at inflation, and this is from a two-sided view, right? We look at inflation from the employee's perspective. What do they have to pay? This is the cost of living issue that comes up frequently. What do employees have to pay for their housing and food and travel and so on? What are they facing? And we have to look at it from the university's perspective as well, which is, what do we have to pay as an institution, not just for compensation, but for all the other things we buy? And in some of those cases, the things that the university buys, the annual rate of change in the cost has exceeded rates of inflation every year. So until recently, for example, library materials were at 5 to 10% increases every year just to maintain the collections we have, let alone expand or enhance them in any way. Things like our technology licensing and maintenance agreements, which go up significantly. Our fringe benefits, our healthcare, which has, depends on the year. We're pretty good at managing healthcare, but generally in many years, the growth in those costs have exceeded the rates of inflation. We also have in certain departments, things that they buy, and this isn't across the whole institution, but some departments have to buy lab supplies, for example, that right now, as we sit here today, are growing at more than 100% per year. They're more than doubling in cost. That can be, for chemicals and reagents. It can be for commodities like gold and, whatever is used, printing materials and so forth. So we have a lot of different inflation rates within the university and have to manage them a little bit differently in the budget process. But that is part of our consideration as well, because that bottom component there is the university's ability to pay. Now, what impacts our ability to pay for compensation increases are these other costs that we also have to pay for. Utilities is another one. And I can rattle off a lot of them, but we have to pay for these other costs. But what also impacts our ability to pay is our resources. And outside of the earned income from sales and gifts and royalty income and grants, outside of that, the O&M appropriation from the state of Minnesota and tuition pay over half of our salaries. And the state appropriation doesn't increase unless the state takes action to actually increase our appropriation. And we work very hard to make that happen, but we don't control it. So that is one huge component in our ability to pay. The other is tuition rates. And here we have to, it's a whole nother balancing act. Just like compensation has things to balance in making the decision, tuition has other things that we have to balance. And that involves, obviously, the ability of students and families to pay. What else, what are they facing in terms of other costs? But it involves things like what's available for financial aid and what types of financial aid do we have available? What are our competitors charging? And so on and so forth. And in the last 10 years, the leadership of the university, including the Board of Regents, has directed us to implement low rates of change in tuition. In some years, we kept it flat. Just like we had to keep salaries flat, we kept tuition rates flat as well. And that significantly impacts our ability to pay. But we do have to manage all of this in a real balancing act, try to put everything on the table and make decisions that we feel ultimately are the best for the institution, are the best for our students, are the best for our employees. And that's what we work to do every year. We are not always able to provide a cost of living increase for our employees because of those other things I mentioned, the other costs that we have and the revenues we have available to make those, to do those costs. Now, to cover those costs. Now, somebody might say, well, you can do that, but you can just cut budgets internally. Yes, and we do cut budgets internally, but only to a certain extent, because we also have to maintain our services, maintain our quality, maintain our jobs for people. And if we cut too deep, all those things suffer. So again, that's another part of trying to balance all these competing needs against each other. We can come back to that, but before we get to questions, I want to speak a little bit to the consultation process that we have built into our annual budget cycle. We meet regularly with our vice presidents, chancellors, and deans. We meet with faculty governance groups, employee governance groups. We meet with our RRC, which stands for Resource Responsibility Center, our major unit chief financial managers. We meet with lots of different groups throughout the year to explain where we're at in the budget process, what we're currently planning, to ask for input on what they see as the primary issues that they're facing and so forth. Oh, and I should add students into this. We also meet with student groups, but we have, in particular, at these timeframes you see here, particular topics that we can talk about. So in the summer of the even numbered year, that's when we talk with all these groups about our biennial budget request to the state of Minnesota and that black box budget framework, the beginning assumptions for those major budget variables. And we throw out ideas and we talk about what we're thinking and try to gain input on those things. The budget framework, then we take more specifically, talking just about FY24 as this year's example. In the September-October timeframe, again, we meet with these groups and walk them through it, including the board, on what we're thinking and what our options are. And then in January, we are just finishing this now, actually, we meet with our Twin Cities deans and our chancellors in our academic units to talk about what we learned from the fall process. The fall support unit budget process. What are the needs? What are the costs that are going up? What are we going to have to face as an institution so that they understand what we have to pay for? And we update the budget framework in January. And then throughout the spring, we come back and as we're developing our budget recommendations to the board, we will again meet with governance groups and faculty and deans and students and so forth to talk again about where we're at and what we're thinking about recommending to the board for action for the next fiscal year. So it tends to be a continuous consultation cycle, really, and we try to meet as often in person. We've learned that posting things on the website isn't sufficient. in this process, that actually meeting with people in person is what we need to do to really hear what's going on, but also have them be able to communicate more effectively about what they're seeing and what the issues are and the questions that they have. So that's all part of the consultation process. And I think with that, that's the end of my prepared comments.
That sounds good.
I do want to pick up on one thing. It's actually not on a slide, but before we get into questions, Monica mentioned at the beginning, as a preamble, if you will, some things about what I can and can't talk about. And so I want to address that a little bit. We do meet with human resources regularly on compensation type issues that they bring forward, that they'd like to have the university address and so forth. And as they've worked through all of their work on market studies and everything, they keep us informed. But at some level, we need to set a budget planning parameter for the institution. And this year it was 3.85%. And within that, and we call it merit, because outside of bargaining unit, there is no requirement that it's a certain percent increase for an individual. That's where we get into the HR side of things. They manage that internal process of individual decisions about pay and by employee groups about pay. But when we set that 3.85%, for example, for this year, we know that within that, units will be working within that pool, and sometimes by supplementing that pool with additional funds that they have to address market concerns for certain individuals or for certain groups of people within their unit. HR is available to work with units to help develop that market understanding for their employees about where they sit in a market and where the real needs are in terms of addressing retention issues and recruiting issues as they intersect with that market concern. So it is a matter of this, think about it as we have this pool of funds, and within that, we need to distribute it in a way that tries to address some of those issues. It won't address all of them. So here's where I want to tell you too, that as the units bring forward their budget issues, concerns, proposals, it isn't unusual for a unit to come in and say, we are having significant issues recruiting and retaining employees in this particular niche area. And we talk about that then as a strategic investment for the institution. Is that some out of that strategic investment pool that we plan for? Is that a high priority that we need to address and to add to, if you will, the compensation, add to the compensation pool budget for specific items? So there's different ways to address market concerns and areas where there is a significant need for, like I said, retention and recruitment improvements. And with that, I think I'll stop. There's other things entering my brain, but why don't we stop and see what the questions are here for a half an hour?
That sounds wonderful. Thanks, Julie. We've bundled up the pre-submitted questions related to budgeting.
Yep.
And our first question is about budget planning and what role does market analysis play when the university is planning for compensation increases?
Yeah, so I tried to address that a little bit. We do look at, as that one slide indicated, we look at market, which means internal around the Twin Cities or in Duluth or in Morris, you know, the local market industry, the local market public service industry or public employers. We look at other higher education institutions, and there it depends on who your competitors are. For the Twin Cities campus, it's a really a national and sometimes an international market for attracting employees depending on the role. And sometimes it's the school down the road. So it kind of depends on what your market is, but that's that information that HR brings to the table about what they're seeing happening elsewhere in industry amongst our competitors for our talent, and we try to fit within the market analysis that HR brings forward, and to stay with the increases. So it's one of the components of setting a plan, but only one. We have to balance it against some of the other components we were looking at.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
I know you touched on departments receiving additional funding for wage increases. Is
Yeah.
there anything more about that you'd like to share?
Yeah, so, and this is something, we didn't really get into in the budget overview, but let me back up just a little bit. When we make our plans for compensation and other expenses in the budget, we do have different approaches depending on funding source a little bit. And let me explain that. If whatever expenses are paid for from generated income, if that's sales, fees, endowment earnings, royalty income, grants, contracts, all those kinds of things. If you're paid, if groups of employees or people are paid from those sources, we rely on the growth in the revenue in those sources to pay for that increase. So if we are going to, if for example, you have employees that are paid from sales income, I'm just going to make this up, out of, let's just say the Bell Museum, and the Bell Museum ticket sales and donations and so forth pay for their employees. The operating assumption is that the revenue growth from those sources will pay for the cost increases for those employees. So the university doesn't, quote, give the unit the revenue. They earn it, they get it directly as they earn it, and that's what's used to pay. If the revenue doesn't keep up, they have two choices. They can eliminate expenses to live within the available resources, which is the first approach. And the second approach is to bring forward the issue to us in the central budget process to see if we can help. And here's where the other piece comes in. The state appropriation and the tuition dollars. Well, the tuition goes directly to the units that generate it, but it is discretionary. And the state appropriation is allocated annually by the university out to the units on a base plus minus process. So there is an element with that state appropriation of the university providing an increase of resources to the units, but only if we get it, right? The university also decides on that tuition rate increase. And when we do that in part to help pay for all of our cost increases. So if you're in a unit that's funded partly by tuition and we increase the tuition rate, that's the university saying, we're going to give you, quote, this revenue increase based on that rate change for your activity. We're going to give you that revenue to help pay your costs. And all of that we talk about with the units. So we understand as we go through the budget process, how their revenues are growing and from what, and how their costs are growing and how the two can or should come together. And when we get an increase in the state appropriation, we have to decide which units get it and for what purpose. So there's different ways, depending on revenue source, that we cover the costs. But having central, quote, give revenue to a unit is only one piece of that puzzle.
Sounds good, thank you. There was a question of how the budgeting plan aligns with teachers and AFSCME.
With teachers?
With Teamsters, sorry.
Oh, Teamsters, okay.
Teamsters, so our
Yep.
I'm totally blanking on the word right now. Sorry, for Teamsters and AFSCME.
Yeah, our bargaining unit.
Bargaining unit,
How
that's what it is.
How
Thank
that
you.
fits in. Yeah, absolutely. So depending on the timing of those negotiations and ultimate contracts, we have to keep the budget moving, right? And so I have been here long enough to have been through years where we don't know what our settlement with our bargaining units is going to be at the time we set the budget. And so we look at the same, we don't treat them any differently. It doesn't really impact the ultimate plan for the salary pool increase in many years, because we don't know what it's going to be. For the years where we know what it's going to be, we obviously have to plan for the expense, but it doesn't automatically mean that that's the increase we're going to go with. That's what we have to pay for those employees, but maybe as an institution, we will have to settle on a salary pool increase that's actually less than the increase we have to give our bargaining unit employees, or maybe it's more. It doesn't automatically mean that's our pool. It's just one of the components that we have to pay for in this larger view of things.
Thank you. There were a couple questions that revolved around student fees and money collected, and if those student fees can't cover merit increases, can those units go to budget and finance to ask for additional funds?
Yeah, so here is an example of, and this happens across other revenue sources, but again, what we'll do first is look to what is the planned increase in those student fees, if anything, right? So if there is a planned increase, we look at, okay, then what are the cost increases that of the items that are paid from that source? What are the cost increases you are facing? One of which is compensation. Does that revenue increase enough to pay those costs? If not, we are only given really two other kinds of choices. Well, maybe three. Well, two. One is you move some of those expenses to another revenue source where you do have capacity. That's one option. Second, so that's sort of, it's not really budget cutting. So I'm going to say there's three choices. One is you move those to another revenue source that where you know you have capacity. A second choice is you make budget reductions. You actually choose through efficiency or any other reason to spend less on something that you're currently spending on today. So take a budget cut in order to pay the pay increases, cover the pay increases. And the third thing is the unit, and I showed you that list of units. We don't receive in requests from departments. We receive requests as part of the coordinated process from the colleges and the major support units. But if that's happening within their unit and they feel it's a priority, they can bring that forward in the budget process and ask for help. And that's where if we have additional state money, then maybe that state money can help pay for that expense. If we don't have additional state money, then we work with the unit to figure out what other options we might have. Can the increase in tuition help pay for those costs? You know, it just depends on the particular financial situation that the unit is in. But certainly always every year, every major unit can bring forward their priority needs. And we want them to, we need them to, because we need to understand what those needs are and what's driving them. So
we had a quick question about what do you mean by unit? Do you have a good definition of that?
Yeah, so that is, and I had that big list up there, and by the way, you have access to this presentation, so you'll have the list if you want it. But we have 50 units, budgeting units at the university. They are each Twin Cities college, each major support unit. So on the Twin Cities campus, that's things like the libraries, the vice president for research, not the budget office, we're small, HR, facilities management, all those support units. And then we have some auxiliary units, that's athletics, auxiliary services on the Twin Cities campus, which includes housing, dining, bookstores, parking, etc. And then each one of our system campuses is a separate budgeting unit. Each of those have departments within them. And we are happy to talk with departments, but through the budget process, we expect and hold the leader of the RRC, the leader of that budgeting unit, that higher level unit, to be accountable for all the financial activity that occurs within it. So that's the level that we deal with.
Sounds good. Thank you. We had a ton of questions come in about inflation and market questions, and I'm just going to summarize them. Is basically, how does the university take into account inflation when it comes to compensation planning?
Yeah. So that is, and I talked about this a little bit too, so it's a little bit repetitive, but it's one of the issues that impact the ultimate decision we make on the pool, right? It's market, it's our ability to pay, it's inflation the university has to pay for, and it's inflation that employees have in their own personal lives. So we monitor inflation, we monitor what expenses it's impacting, and use that as one component of setting the pool. I mentioned that the year we're currently in, 3.85% increase in the pool was the largest pool I've seen in 30 years. I will tell you, I think that that was driven largely by two things. Inflation. Now, could we hit the 8% inflation that CPI was going up? No, we can't. And employers rarely do that. When inflation goes, because inflation, as I mentioned, in this 10-year time frame, it's gone from 0.1% 1 year to 8% in I have it right here, was 2022. As a year, CPI was 8%. That's a huge swing. Most employers will not take that variable swing in what they provide their employees, and they try to put it within a range of more stability. 1 for employees and 2 for the institution itself. We can't afford it. We couldn't afford 8%. So, but we worked really hard. In fact, we did a lot of cuts. We cut units 2.5% this year to pay for, in large part, that 3.85% increase for our employees. So it is absolutely one of the things we take into consideration, but it's not a 1-for-1. It's not a determinant in and of itself, because we have to look at what are we experiencing in terms of recruiting and retention issues, and where are those? What are we, and what else do we have to pay, and what are our available resources? So we really have tried to provide some element of inflation, but more thinking about it in terms of a steadier range of pay increases for our employees. Because while this year, it was 3.85 against, well, I don't know how the inflation rate's going to come out this year, but it's going to be closer to 6%, I think. But in that year where we had a 0.1% increase in inflation, our pay increases for employees was 2.5%, as an example. So we try to keep it a little bit steady, knowing how it impacts people from an inflationary perspective.
Sounds good. Thanks. I think I'm going to jump over to actually some questions asked live.
Sure.
and get to some of those. I'm reading so that I think you kind of addressed this with revenue coming in to a specific unit based on tickets sold or commercialization or things like that. The question is, I understand that Central doesn't give units the money for salary increases, that units have to come up with that money themselves. And I'm assuming that's in relation to units that have revenue generating opportunities.
That's correct. And as I mentioned, the state appropriation and tuition pay for 50, I think it's about 53% of our total compensation costs. So that means that the other 48% comes from all those other sources. And they're varied. So some units are very dependent on research grants, for example, from the federal government. That pays for a lot of our employees. And so the pay increases for those individuals are funded out of the grant. And that's built into the grant budget spending plan, as an example. Sales income, same thing. If I mentioned the Bell Museum, their ability to generate entrance fees, tickets, camp revenues, all those types of things impacts the number of employees that they have and what they are able to pay their employees. That goes on and on for all sorts of different kinds of revenue at the institution, including student fees, including royalty income from our inventions, endowment earnings, which is an interest earnings on the endowment that pays for some faculty salaries and so forth. And where it becomes tricky is, as I mentioned, as part of the budget, we do an all funds budget process. So we ask units to bring forward concerns they have in any part of the budget. And that includes their inability to raise revenues to pay for their current staffing levels. And then we have questions about, okay, what's driving that? Why can't you? Do we need the staffing levels that we have? If the answer is yes, what are our alternatives? So the institution doesn't get that revenue. It goes directly to those units. So the institution can't, quote, give revenue to that revenue to the units. It happens automatically. But as I mentioned, if we get increases in the state money, or if we choose to increase the tuition rates, those are ways we can direct increased revenue to priority needs. And so if there's those priority needs out in the units, they can bring it to our attention and we can work with them on a solution for those payments.
That sounds good. Thank you. There was sorry, I'm jumping around in my list of questions here. Speaking of grants, there was a question asked of including tips to deal with grant programs whose financial calendars differ from that of the university. Do you have any suggestions for that one?
You know, I would suggest that you talk to SPA, Sponsored Projects Administration, or the OVPR office, Vice President for Research office, about that. They have a lot more experience in managing the timing elements of grants. We don't get into that as much. The sponsored side of the house is a little bit different in how it works. It's much more restricted. They have a lot more regulations and rules to follow. And so there's more hoops to jump through and plans that have to get approved and so forth. So I would just suggest you talk to them about that specific question in the timing aspect.
Sounds good. Thank you. We have probably time for a couple more questions. I know we've had a ton of questions come through in Q&A, and I want to reassure everyone that the document that we're taking notes in will be provided to Julie for her to take the opportunity to provide feedback to the questions she is able to. And we will get that sent out probably in a couple weeks to everyone. But fear not, questions will be addressed. It just may not be done live. This was an interesting question, and I don't know if you can answer it. OHR has implemented a different compensation model where there is more market data available, compa ratios, and fully competent staff being at salary medians. While this is separate from the usability to pay for these salaries, are we working on a budget compensation and merit increases to support this framework? Side note that it's demoralizing to staff to know that everyone knows we don't pay the market or fully competent staff even close to what the median pay is for their position.
Yeah, and what I can't really speak to is that last piece about where we sit. I mean, that's sort of an HR specialty in terms of understanding for different employee groups and even subsets of employee groups and where they sit within the markets that they're looking at and the compa ratios and all that. But what I can speak to is that we have been working with HR to figure out a way to build more of a market pool into our general compensation pool strategies. And so I think there will be more in the future around that and trying to figure out what makes sense. Unfortunately, some of that gets complicated by our multiple funding sources because as you think about pay for an individual and what they do, it shouldn't matter at all what funds they're paid from, and it doesn't. But what matters is the planning around it. And so it becomes more difficult to plan across funding sources for unique situations. But I do have some confidence that with the recent work they've done that you pointed out in your question, and the conversations we've had with HR, that we will be able to come up with, I think, some creative ways to build that more into our compensation planning from the budget side of things. Just don't have it ready yet.
Sounds good. Thank you. We'll see. I probably have time for two more questions. The first one, is there a particular reserve required for non-O&M funds that support salaries in order to accommodate these annual raise pools. For example, if a group of staff are paid via ICR, does that fund need to maintain a certain level of reserve year to year to cover the percent raise pool for FY23?
Yeah, no, the answer is no. In fact, a reserve is a little bit tricky because often a reserve is one-time money. And we instruct units not to allocate one-time dollars as much as possible to recurring salary increase expenses. So what we're looking for is a recurring increase in revenue. If they're primarily paid for from ICR and the ICR is growing, so it gets a little tricky because as the ICR is growing, they can commit that to the pay increases every year. But then let's say that the unit has an off year and all of a sudden they lose some grants and the revenue goes down. That's where the reserve comes in, because if they have built a balance that they've been able to set aside, that's one-time money, but maybe that's all they need to get them through a year or two of lower revenue until the revenue returns. That's a possibility. But generally speaking, if that reserve or balance is one-time money, we don't want to commit it on a recurring and permanent basis to pay increases because it'll disappear. And then we don't have the revenue behind it to support that increase.
Okay, sounds good. One question of, could you repeat the amount of salaries that is paid by tuition?
I don't have just tuition alone, but and the reason for that is tuition and state appropriation in our ledger, in our financial system, are commingled as they are spent. So the tuition and the state O&M appropriation are put into one allocation, one number, one revenue, and then that revenue gets spent. Those two combined account for about 50, I think this year we're expecting 52% of all of our compensation expenses to be paid from those two sources combined.
Sounds good. Oh, we have time for one more. This is kind of just a general question. What is your favorite part about the budget process and why?
Huh. That's a very nice question. Thank you, whoever asked that question. My favorite part about and people are going to just die probably. My favorite part about the budget process is meeting with every unit every year. Because I can't tell you, there's very few places and very few jobs, frankly, like mine, where I get exposed to everything that the university does. Literally, I mean, almost everything in one form or another, I've been exposed to. And I find that very energizing and exciting. And it keeps you young and it keeps you interested. And so that's my favorite part, because they bring forward their priorities and the neat stuff that they do, the neat stuff you all do. I mean, you guys are out there, the neat stuff that you're working on and being a part of is amazing. And I love to hear about it. So that's my favorite part.
Sounds good. Thank you. Probably have one more I'm looking through here. Let's see here. Sorry, it's taking me a bit here. I did not. I think we're going to have to table some of these, and we'll let you review the questions after the fact and answer the ones that you're able to. So what I want to say is thank you everyone for joining today. I know we didn't get to all of your questions. This is a very personal topic for a lot of people. And it's great that you spent time with us today, Julie, to tell us about the budgeting portion of it. And that is, like you said, it's you have a black box, and to a lot of people, it is a black box that we do not have insight into. So on behalf of P&A Senate and everyone attending today, I wanted to extend a big, huge thank you for joining us and sharing your knowledge and expertise on these nuances of the university budget, of which compensation is a portion of that. And We thank you so much for that time that you spent today. And for everyone else, a link to this recording and the notes document will be ready in about 2 weeks and sent to all registrants and attendees. And last plug for Senate governance, if you're interested in learning more about Senate governance, please visit usenate.umn.edu. And thank you, everyone, and please enjoy the rest of your day.